My name is Tiffany Lashmet. I'm an Extension Agricultural Loss Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and today we're going to look at some of the legal issues facing potential hemp producers. We'll start this section with an overview of the USDA final hemp rule, which was passed at the end of January 2021. Before we get started, I have to give a little disclaimer. Basically says I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, so I can't give you any specific legal advice, but I'm glad to give some general information about this new rule. Essentially, the rule is going to modify what was contained in the interim final hemp rule that was passed in 2020. It makes some minor but important changes to hemp production on the federal level. The rule will be effective on March 22nd, 2021, and it does the following concepts. The first is it increases the sampling window from 15 days to 30 days before harvest. This allows a little bit more leeway for a producer to get the sample taken before harvest begins. And that was a concern that a lot of folks had about the interim rule, was that really narrow 15-day window. So that's been doubled, and it now will allow producers to have 30 days. Additionally, it modifies where the samples are going to be taken from the plant. A lot of people had really pushed in the comments regarding this rule to have a whole plant sampling model. And the rule doesn't go that far, but I think it's at least a little bit better than what was in the interim final rule. So the interim final rule said that the samples had to come from the top third of the plant. The new final rule from USDA says that it has to come from the flowering tops of the plant, which is going to be 5 to 8 inches from the main stem, which is going to include the leaves and flowers, the terminal bud, which occurs at the end of a stem, or the central cola, which is a cut stem that could develop into a bud. So again, essentially what that's going to do is allow there to be more leaves and stems in the sampling process, and in general that should probably be more beneficial to producers, as it would be less likely for a hot crop to be hot in that scenario. Another change to the sampling and testing process is the rule allows some flexibility for states and tribes. Instead of having to follow the specific protocol that was set out in the interim final rule, this rule is going to allow a state or a tribe to implement what they call a performance-based method. Essentially, it's going to let states come up with their own sampling methods that can take into account different factors. So these are going to include things like the state can consider its seed certification process. It can consider whether a producer is conducting research on hemp at an institution of higher education, or if their research is government funded. It can consider whether a producer has consistently produced a compliant hemp plant over a certain period of time. It can consider whether a producer is growing immature hemp, such as seedlings, clones, microgreens, and other non-flowering cannabis. And so, again, it just gives the state a little bit more flexibility in that testing methodology. Now, these state or tribe-specific plans will have to be approved by the USDA. And USDA has put together a sampling guide that really goes into some detail on this. You can find that at the AMS USDA website if you want more information. Another step taken by the final rule is it extends the waiver of the DEA registered laboratory testing requirement. It requires that a lab be DEA certified, which is the drug enforcement agency. And there's really kind of a small number of labs that meet that qualification. And there was a lot of concern that this was going to create some backlog. And when you combine that with that 15-day testing window, there was a lot of concern from growers about the ability to get those tests taken care of in a timely fashion. So last growing season, the USDA and the Texas Department of Agriculture both suspended the requirement that it had to be done at a DEA laboratory. That now that kind of suspension or waiver of that requirement is included in the final rule, and the waiver is in place through 2022. And if you read some of the comments related to the rule, it explains that the hope is that will give labs enough time to become DEA certified. Another important change has to do with what I call the safe harbor provision when it comes to enforcement. So if you look at the enforcement mechanisms under the statute, if a person has a negligent violation, including growing a crop that's over that 0.3% THC limit, there's a bunch of steps that they have to take, and there can be implications from being negligent. However, the rule has kind of a safe harbor, and it essentially says even if you grow a crop that is hot, right, over a certain percent, over the 0.3% THC, we're going to give you a kind of a safe harbor that says you're not negligent so long as you use reasonable growing practices and the crop doesn't test higher than a certain percent. So in the interim final rule, that percent was 0.5. So essentially, if you had a crop that was hot, right, it's over the 0.3% limit, but it's less than 0.5, you weren't going to be negligent so long as you used reasonable growing practices. This rule actually increases the limit from 0.5 to 1%. So now, even if your crop is hot, no negligent violation if you use reasonable growing methods and it tests less than 1% THC. Now, importantly, I want to make clear, just because the producer won't be negligent, that crop is still hot, right? So it's still going to have to be destroyed in accordance with the rules. It's just that the producer won't also face the ramifications of a negligent violation. There's an additional concept here related to negligent violations in the final rule, and it's a limitation that says growers will not receive more than one negligent violation per growing season. So that's a new addition to the rule as well. Additionally, the USDA rule allows for a new option when it comes to destruction of a hot crop, and that's going to be remediation. And this is completely new. This was not in the interim final rule. This came out of the comments that folks made to USDA about that rule. And essentially what remediation is going to let growers do is go in and try to modify their crop in a way that they can retest it and have it test under that 0.3% limit. So one option may be to remove and destroy flowering material and just retest the stalks, the stems, the leaves, etc., right? Because a lot of times the higher THC contents in the flower, you could take the flowers off, test the rest. Another option would be to shred the entire plant and create kind of a biomass-like material and retest it. So again, it's probably not ideal for a producer, right, who was planning on growing a crop, especially if that was going to be for CBD, but it will at least allow you to hopefully recover some value from a crop if you can test it again and get below that 0.3% THC level. Also related to disposal, the rule sort of adopts what both TDA and USDA had done last year with regard to allowing for disposal methods. You might remember that initially in the interim final rule, anybody who was going to dispose of a crop that was unauthorized was going to have to use the DEA reverse distributor method under the Controlled Substances Act, which was going to be really complicated and really expensive. The USDA and TDA suspended that last season and listed a number of methods that folks could use to destroy crops, including plowing under, mulching or composting, disking, shredding with a bush mower or chopper, burying or burning. So those, again, were in place last year. They now are part of the final rule, and they've added in a remediation option. Again, USDA has a great guideline on this if you go to the AMS USDA Hemp website. So just sort of to wrap it up, there have been a number of amendments that were made in this final USDA rule. Most of them are designed to allow more flexibility for producers, and I think grower groups were happy with the changes that were made. It's really important to watch how your state or tribe implements these new USDA rules into their state or tribal statutes and regulations. So, for example, just because USDA passed these rules, they're not yet part of Texas law. And so I really expect to see either the Texas legislature and or the Texas Department of Agriculture modify their statutes and regulations to match these rules. But that hasn't been done as of yet since they're so new. So just keep an eye on that. I expect that to happen, but again, double check that those rules are adopted. The last thing I'll mention is that there were several controversial regulations in that initial final rule that were not changed, despite a number of comments seeking for them to be. The first one is when you're measuring THC, it's still the total THC measurement that's required. So that's both the THC level and the THCA, which is the kind of THC acid. It's going to still be a total THC measurement that's required. The THC content limit remains at 0.3%. There had been some call to increase that. It was not changed. And whole plant sampling is still not allowed. So, again, that's just an overview of the changes in the final USDA hemp regulation. Make sure you check and see how your state implements those changes.